Good morning. What's the difference with a ministry and an apostolate? You have no idea. I'll enlighten you. Does anybody have an idea? One is lay and one is clergy. Sorta, yeah. Anything else? What does an apostolate sound like? It comes from the word apostle. And what is an apostle? Well, one who is sent forth, right. So an apostolate then is something that an apostle does, right? In the world, you're sent forth to do something. A ministry is related to worship. So, the ordained ministers are involved, essential, I guess, really. But you do have lay ministers like the readers, and you have the musicians and the altar servers, and all of those bits. But ministry is focused on kind of what we're doing, worshiping God. Apostolate is what we're sent out into the world to do. We're sent into the apostolate as apostles, as ones who Christ has called and sent forth. The end of Mass, go forth, the Mass is ended, right? Go forth, you're sent into the world to proclaim the gospel. And when we think of an apostolate, when we think of the many ways in which we are called to live the gospel, in which we are called to serve in the world, one of the most common, I think, for us, especially here, is work among the poor, right? Taking care of the poor and serving the poor, because in the poor we find Christ. There's this desire in the modern world and in the church to eradicate poverty. And I think that that's demonic, to try to eradicate poverty, because if we eradicate poverty, we eradicate Christ. It's in poverty that we find Christ, right? That's why it's one of the not theological virtues, the something virtue, apostolic virtues. Back to that word again, of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty. It's in poverty that we find Christ. And so among our work with the poor, not to eradicate poverty, but rather to lift up those who suffer, but also to find the goodness of God, to find God in the poor, to recognize that in the poor we see perhaps a lack of materialism that affects the rest of us, and that we can see that simplicity and that humility that is so necessary for us to follow Christ. So today's the feast day of St. Vincent de Paul. Of course, we have our St. Vincent de Paul Society that does much good work in the community, and is a reminder for us of finding Christ in the poor. St. Vincent de Paul himself was a French priest. Don't hold that against him that he was French, because he was a good guy. And he dedicated himself to ministering to the poor, and he dedicated himself to caring for those in poverty. And so his legacy lives on in this work, this apostolate of care for the poor through St. Vincent de Paul, through assisting people who can't pay their bills, assisting people who need food, assisting people who need medical care, assisting people who need shelter, all of those things. We have a great number of, what do you call them? Not Vincentians. I was thinking Paulins, or I don't know. Paulins, yeah. Vincentians. We have a great number of Vincentians here at St. Clair that are very dedicated to the work of the apostolate of St. Vincent de Paul, taking food to those in need, working in the thrift store, and all of the many things that they do. And then, of course, next door we have that little tiny parish in Dallas called St. Vincent de Paul, and they're all right, I guess. I had dinner with Father Adrian last night, and it's always a delight. He reminded me again that St. Vincent de Paul has no debt, and that we have a great burdensome debt, but that's okay. We recognize through the the work of St. Vincent de Paul, the person, the saint. Through his work, through his prayer, many were led to Christ. And ultimately, that's his legacy now, is that we lead others to Christ. A lot of people see the Catholic Church as this charitable organization, and we're the largest charitable organization in the world, even when the world tries to tie one of our hands behind our backs. But we indeed are the largest charitable organization in the world, but that charity is focused on leading others to Christ. It is through the charitable works that we do, not just to be able to be nice, not just be able to get along, but it's through those works that we lead others to Christ, right? We lead others to Christ. All that we do ought to be focused on that. All that we do ought to be focused on that. If we're not leading others to Christ through our works are in vain. If we're not leading others to Christ through what we do, through what we say, through how we act, we're wasting our time. And so that has to be the root of all that we do. We don't help those in need. We don't help the poor because that's what good people do. We don't help the poor because it'll be a nice write-off of my taxes. But rather, we help the poor because we encounter Christ in them. And in encountering Christ in them, we're able to lead them closer to Christ. We're able to lead others closer to Christ. We're able to better encounter Christ. And so in our own lives, all that we do must be focused on that. How can I encounter Christ? How can I lead others to Christ? It's a question that all of us have to ponder. It's a question that all of us have to focus in on in our daily lives. In all that I do, how can I lead others to Christ? And so on this feast day of St. Vincent de Paul, let us pray for his intercession that we indeed may be able to encounter Christ more fully, and in that encounter we may be able to lead others to him.